Let's get right into it. We've talked about the architecture of security, policies, frameworks, and technical controls. But now we need to talk about the most unpredictable, most fascinating, and often most dangerous component of any security system. People. This is Domain 1 territory, specifically the human side of security and risk management. We're building the human firewall. And trust me, this is where many organizations, and many exam candidates, get tripped up. Because you can have the most expensive firewall on the market, the most advanced encryption algorithms, and a perfect patch management schedule. But one employee clicking one wrong link. That's game over. So let's dive into the psychology, the life cycle, and the practical controls that turn your people from the weakest link into your greatest asset. Here's the uncomfortable truth that every CISO and every security professional has to accept. Humans are simultaneously our greatest vulnerability and our most vital asset. Look at it this way. On one hand, without proper training and oversight, your people can subvert the most robust technical defenses you can buy. A phishing email gets past your filters. That's a technical failure. But an employee who ignores security warnings because they're in a hurry? That's a human failure. And that human failure can bypass encryption, firewalls, and intrusion detection systems in a single click. That's why we call people the weakest link. Not because they're stupid or careless, but because they're human. They get tired. They get distracted. They get manipulated. But here's the other side of that coin. When properly trained, when properly engaged, when properly empowered, those same people become the living, breathing foundation of your security posture. They become sensors. They become defenders. They become the ones who spot that phishing email before anyone else does. A strong human firewall doesn't just follow rules, they understand the why behind the rules. And that understanding changes behavior. Sample question: an organization deploys advanced endpoint detection, email filtering, and network segmentation. Despite these controls, a breach occurs when an employee clicks a malicious link in a phishing email. What is the primary weakness? The answer is the human element. The technical controls fail to prevent human error, which means the organization needs better security awareness training. Tip: when you see questions about security failures, always consider whether the root cause is technical or human. Pitfall: don't assume that technology can solve every problem. The CISSP recognizes that security is a socio-technical system. You need both. Now let's walk through the personnel security lifecycle. This is a continuous process, and if you treat it as a one-time event, you're going to have gaps. The lifecycle has three major phases: onboarding, tenure, and offboarding. Phase 1 is onboarding. This is the foundation. You start by verifying trust through background checks. Depending on the sensitivity of the role, this could be anything from a simple criminal record check to a full background investigation with credit checks, reference verification, and even polygraph exams for government positions. Next, you establish identity and access management, or IAM. This is where you create the user account, assign initial permissions, and issue badges and tokens. And finally, you secure commitment through legal agreements. NDAs to protect confidential information. Non-compete agreements to protect intellectual property. And acceptable use policies, or AUPs, which define what employees can and cannot do with company systems. Phase 2 is tenure. This is where most organizations drop the ball. You cannot just onboard someone and forget about them. During tenure, you need continuous oversight of job responsibilities to prevent privilege creep. Privilege creep happens when employees change roles, get promoted, or take on temporary assignments, and their old permissions never get removed. Over time, they accumulate far more access than they actually need. That's a massive insider threat risk. Regular access reviews are non-negotiable. Phase 3 is offboarding. And I want you to remember this phrase. Offboarding must be handled like a bomb defusal. Immediate. Simultaneous. Complete. The moment an employee leaves, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, you need to revoke all access. All of it. Badges, keys, VPN tokens, cloud application access, email, everything. And you need to do it at the exact same time. Why? Because if you revoke building access but leave email active for another hour, that departing employee could send malicious emails or exfiltrate data from the parking lot. You also need to promptly collect all mobile devices, laptops, and any physical media. Sample question: a system administrator is terminated for cause. The security team revokes his building badge but forgets to disable his VPN access. 3 hours later, he logs in remotely and deletes critical files. What security process failed? The answer is offboarding, specifically the lack of simultaneous revocation of all access methods. Tip: remember the mantra: onboard with verification, manage with continuous review, offboard with immediate and complete revocation. Pitfall: don't assume that voluntary resignations are low risk. A disgruntled employee leaving on their own terms still has hours or days to cause damage before their last day. Let's talk about internal threats. Not every attacker is wearing a hoodie in a dark room. Some of them already have a badge and a desk. And mitigating internal threats requires strict privilege management. I'm going to give you 5 critical controls that the exam absolutely loves. First, the principle of least privilege. This is foundational. You grant the absolute minimum access necessary to perform required tasks. Not more. Not less. If a database administrator only needs to back up a specific database, they don't need admin rights to the entire server. Least privilege limits the blast radius when an account is compromised. Second, mandatory vacations. This sounds old school, but it is incredibly effective. You force employees in sensitive positions to take 2 consecutive weeks off. During that time, someone else, a peer or an auditor, must perform their duties. Why does this work? Because if someone is committing fraud or hiding some kind of abuse, they can't keep it hidden for 2 straight weeks. Someone else will notice the anomaly. Mandatory vacations are a detective control. Third, separation of duties. This means requiring multiple individuals to complete a critical task. The classic example is financial transactions. One person initiates a payment, another person approves it. Neither can complete the transaction alone. This prevents unilateral fraud. Fourth, job rotation. You shift responsibilities periodically. The person who manages firewall rules this quarter might manage identity management next quarter. This uncovers long-term undetected abuse because different people see different things. It also cross-trains your team and reduces key person dependency. Fifth, User and Entity Behavior Analytics, or UEBA. This is where artificial intelligence and machine learning come into play. UEBA tools track user behavior, login times, file access patterns, data transfer volumes, and build a baseline of normal activity. When something deviates from that baseline, even if the individual action looks legitimate in isolation, the system raises an alert. Sample question: a financial analyst has the ability to both create new vendors and approve payments to those vendors. What control is missing? Separation of duties. Another question: an organization requires all privileged users to take 5 consecutive business days off each year. What is the primary purpose of this control? To detect fraud or abuse that would be uncovered when someone else performs the duties. Tip: when you see questions about insider threats, think about which control is preventive, which is detective, and which is corrective. Least privilege and separation of duties are preventive. Mandatory vacations and job rotation are detective. Pitfall: don't assume that technical controls alone can stop a determined insider. An insider with legitimate credentials and knowledge of your systems is incredibly dangerous. That's why you need administrative controls like job rotation and separation of duties. We can't ignore the fact that the perimeter has expanded. Your employees aren't just in the office anymore. They're working from home, from coffee shops, from airports. And your third-party vendors, contractors, and business partners have access to your systems. That's the expanded perimeter. And securing it relies on contractual enforcement. What does that mean? It means you need legally binding agreements that extend your security requirements to external parties. These are your third-party risk management tools. Service Level Agreements, or SLAs, define the level of service expected, including security response times. Business Partner Agreements establish security obligations between organizations. Memoranda of Understanding, or MOUs, and Interconnection Security Agreements, or ISAs, are used between government agencies or between organizations that share systems. The key here is that you cannot just trust that a vendor has good security. You need to verify. You need contracts that give you the right to audit, the right to receive breach notifications, and the right to enforce security requirements. And you need to reassess these relationships regularly. A vendor that was secure last year might not be secure this year. Sample question: a company hires an external call center to handle customer support. The call center employees need access to the company's customer database. What is the most important document to have in place before granting access? A business partner agreement or an interconnection security agreement that defines security requirements, data handling procedures, and breach notification obligations. Tip: when you see questions about third-party risk, remember that you cannot delegate responsibility. You can outsource a function, but you cannot outsource the risk. The organization is still accountable. Pitfall: don't assume that a signed contract means the vendor is actually following security practices. You need ongoing monitoring and audit rights. Now we need to revisit risk management, but this time from a cyclical mechanics perspective. Risk management is not a one-time project. It is a continuous loop. And the exam expects you to understand the relationship between 5 core elements: asset, threat, vulnerability, risk, and safeguard. Let's walk through them in order. First, you have an asset. This is the valuable item you're trying to protect. It could be tangible, like a server, a laptop, or a building. Or it could be intangible, like intellectual property, customer data, or your company's reputation. Second, you have a threat. This is the potential harm that could come to that asset. It's the malware. It's the natural disaster. It's the insider threat. And critically, you also need to consider the threat vector. That's the path of delivery. For malware, the vector might be a phishing email. For a physical intruder, the vector might be an unlocked door. Third, you have a vulnerability. This is the weakness or the hole in your defense. It's the unpatched server. It's the employee who hasn't been trained. It's the firewall rule that's too permissive. Vulnerabilities exist independently of threats. A vulnerability is just a weakness. It only becomes dangerous when a threat exploits it. Fourth, you have risk. Risk is the probability that a threat will exploit a vulnerability, multiplied by the severity of the impact. That's the formula. Probability times impact. Low probability with low impact equals low risk. High probability with high impact equals high risk. You need to prioritize based on this calculation. Fifth, you have a safeguard. This is the countermeasure you implement to reduce the vulnerability. It's the patch. It's the training. It's the firewall rule. Safeguards are your controls. Sample question: an organization identifies that an unpatched web server is vulnerable to a known exploit. There are no known active threats targeting this specific server at this time. What is the risk? The risk is low to medium. There is a vulnerability, but the probability of exploitation is currently low. However, if an active threat appears, the risk increases. Tip: when you see risk questions, separate the elements. Identify the asset, the threat, the vulnerability, then calculate the risk. Pitfall: don't confuse a threat with a vulnerability. The threat is the attacker. The vulnerability is the open window. They are not the same thing. When you evaluate threat impact, you have two primary methodologies: qualitative and quantitative analysis. You need to understand both because the exam will test the difference. Qualitative analysis is scenario-based and subjective. You use categories like high, medium, and low. You gather a group of experts, you brainstorm threats, and you assign relative ratings. The advantage of qualitative analysis is that it's faster, it doesn't require precise financial data, and it works well when you don't have hard numbers. The disadvantage is that it's subjective. Two different groups could come up with two different results. Qualitative analysis is great for prioritizing risks and for getting buy-in from stakeholders who don't love spreadsheets. Quantitative analysis is mathematical and objective. You assign actual dollar values. You calculate annualized loss expectancy, or ALE. The formula is ALE equals single loss expectancy times annualized rate of occurrence. Single loss expectancy is the cost of a single incident. Annualized rate of occurrence is how many times you expect that incident to happen per year. Multiply them together, and you get your expected annual loss from that risk. The advantage of quantitative analysis is that it's objective and gives you hard numbers for cost-benefit analysis. The disadvantage is that it's hard to get accurate data, especially for rare events. Sample question: a company estimates that a data breach would cost $500,000 per incident. Based on industry data, they expect one breach every 5 years. What is the annualized loss expectancy? $100,000. Because single loss expectancy is $500,000, annualized rate of occurrence is 0.2, and 500,000 times 0.2 equals 100,000. Another question: a risk assessment team ranks risks as critical, high, medium, and low based on expert opinion. What type of risk analysis is this? Qualitative. Tip: know the formulas. Single loss expectancy, annualized rate of occurrence, annualized loss expectancy. And know that quantitative gives you numbers you can put in a budget request. Qualitative gives you a heat map. Pitfall: don't think that qualitative is inferior. In real-world security, most organizations use qualitative analysis because the data for true quantitative analysis is rarely available. Let's talk about money. Security is not a charity. Every control you recommend has a cost. And senior management needs to see the financial justification. That's where we use return on investment, or ROI, and the concept of cost-benefit analysis. Here's the simple version. You calculate the cost of implementing a control. Then you calculate the expected loss reduction from that control. If the loss reduction is greater than the cost, you have a positive ROI. If it's less, you need to reevaluate. But there's another metric you need to know. Residual risk. Residual risk is the risk that remains after you implement a control. It's never zero. You cannot eliminate all risk. Your goal is to reduce risk to a level that senior management is willing to accept. That's the risk appetite. Here's a sample calculation. A company faces a risk with an annualized loss expectancy of $1 million. A proposed security control costs $300,000 per year to implement and maintain. The control is expected to reduce the risk by 80%. The new ALE after the control would be $200,000. The loss reduction is $800,000. The control costs $300,000. Net benefit is $500,000. That's a good investment. Now, if the control cost $900,000 per year, the net benefit would be negative. That control might not be justified unless there are compliance requirements or reputational factors that aren't captured in the financial calculation. Sample question: an organization is considering a security control that costs $50,000 per year. The control reduces the ALE from $200,000 to $30,000. What is the net benefit? The ALE reduction is $170,000. The cost is $50,000. Net benefit is $120,000. Tip: when you see questions about security spending, always do the math. The exam expects you to calculate ALE, ROI, and net benefit. Pitfall: don't forget about intangible factors. Reputational damage, regulatory fines, and loss of customer trust might not show up in a simple ALE calculation, but they matter. When you identify a risk, you have 5 strategic response options. Memorize these. Mitigate, transfer, deter, avoid, and accept. The exam will test your ability to choose the right one. First, mitigate. This means you actively patch the leak. You implement controls to reduce the likelihood or the impact of the risk. You install a firewall. You patch the software. You train your employees. Mitigation is what most people think of as security. Second, transfer. You shift the financial burden to someone else. The most common example is cybersecurity insurance. You pay a premium, and if a breach occurs, the insurance company pays part of the cost. But here's the catch: you cannot transfer responsibility. You can transfer financial risk, but you are still accountable for protecting the data. Outsourcing is another form of transfer. When you move your email to a cloud provider, you transfer some of the operational risk, but you retain the ultimate responsibility. Third, deter. You discourage threat actors through warnings or visible controls. A beware of dog sign deters a burglar. A visible security camera deters an intruder. A warning banner on your login screen deters an unauthorized user. Deterrence doesn't stop a determined attacker, but it makes them choose an easier target. Fourth, avoid. You eliminate the risk entirely by not engaging in the risky activity. You terminate a risky project. You shut down an old, vulnerable system. You decide not to store certain types of data. Avoidance is the only response that completely eliminates the risk. But it also eliminates any benefits that came with the activity. Fifth, accept. You do nothing. Consciously. With documentation. Acceptance means you have analyzed the risk, determined that the cost of the safeguard is higher than the potential loss, and you have decided to simply accept the risk. This is a management decision. It must be documented. And here's the critical distinction: acceptance is not the same as ignoring or rejecting risk. Ignoring risk is negligence. Acceptance is a deliberate, informed decision. Sample question: an organization decides to purchase cyber liability insurance to cover potential losses from a data breach. What risk response strategy is this? Transfer. Another question: a company identifies a legacy system that cannot be patched and contains sensitive data. They decide to shut down the system and migrate the data to a new platform. What risk response is this? Avoid. Tip: look for keywords. Insurance equals transfer. Shutdown equals avoid. Training or firewall equals mitigate. Warning signs equal deter. And documented do nothing equals accept. Pitfall: never confuse acceptance with ignorance. If the exam describes a situation where management simply ignores a known risk, that is not acceptance. That is negligence. Security controls are typically organized into 3 layers: administrative, logical or technical, and physical. You need to understand all 3 because the exam expects you to recommend controls from each layer. Layer 1 is administrative. These are the rules. The human-driven policies. Hiring practices. Training programs. Incident response plans. Security awareness campaigns. Administrative controls are often the cheapest to implement but the hardest to enforce. You can write a policy that says all passwords must be strong, but if no one follows it, the policy is worthless. Layer 2 is logical or technical. These are the digital moat. Hardware and software mechanisms. Multi-factor authentication, or MFA. Encryption. Firewalls. Intrusion detection systems. Anti-malware software. Technical controls are automated and consistent. They don't get tired. They don't make judgment errors. But they can be expensive, and they can be misconfigured. Layer 3 is physical. These are the stone walls. Tangible, real-world barriers. Security guards. Man-traps, which are access vestibules where one door closes before another opens. CCTV cameras. Fences. Locks. Environmental controls like fire suppression and backup generators. Physical controls prevent physical access to your facilities and equipment. Sample question: a company implements a policy requiring all employees to complete annual security awareness training. What type of control is this? Administrative. Another question: a company installs biometric fingerprint scanners at all data center entrances. What type of control is this? Physical and also technical. Biometrics are physical controls because they control physical access, but they are also technical because they use technology. Tip: when you recommend controls, think across all 3 layers. Don't just say implement MFA. Also say update the acceptable use policy to require MFA and install physical locks on server racks. Pitfall: don't assume that administrative controls are weak. They are often the most important because they shape behavior. A well-trained workforce is more valuable than any single technical control. Controls can also be categorized by their functional timing. You have preventive, detective, corrective, deterrent, recovery, and compensating controls. Let's break them down. Preventive controls stop an incident from happening in the first place. A firewall prevents unauthorized network access. A lock prevents unauthorized physical entry. Encryption prevents a data thief from reading stolen files. Detective controls identify that an incident is happening or has already happened. An intrusion detection system detects an attack. A log review detects unauthorized access after the fact. A security camera detects an intruder. Corrective controls fix the damage after an incident. A backup restore corrects data loss. A patch corrects a vulnerability that was exploited. An incident response team corrects the security gap. Deterrent controls discourage attackers. A warning sign deters a casual intruder. A visible security camera deters a potential thief. The difference between deterrent and preventive is subtle. Deterrent discourages, preventive blocks. Recovery controls restore operations after an incident. Disaster recovery plans. Backup generators. Alternate work sites. Recovery controls are your BCDR toolkit. Compensating controls are alternative controls that you use when you cannot implement the primary control. For example, if you cannot implement a technical control because of legacy system limitations, you might implement a manual review process as a compensating control. Compensating controls must be approved by an auditor and must provide equivalent protection. Sample question: a firewall blocks unauthorized traffic. What type of control is this? Preventive. Another question: a security information and event management system generates an alert when a brute force attack is detected. What type of control is this? Detective. Tip: when the exam asks for the best control type for a given scenario, preventive is almost always preferred if it's feasible. But detective controls are essential because you cannot prevent everything. Pitfall: don't confuse deterrent with preventive. A sign that says no trespassing deters, but it does not prevent. A locked door prevents. Now we get into the psychology of attack. Social engineering hacks the human mind, not the technology. And it is one of the most effective attack methods because your firewall doesn't have emotions, but your employees do. Let me give you 4 principles that attackers exploit. First, authority and intimidation. Humans have a natural instinct to obey perceived leaders. An attacker spoofs the CEO's email address and demands an urgent wire transfer. Or they pretend to be from IT support and threaten to disable the account if the user doesn't provide their password immediately. Authority overrides critical thinking. Second, trust and familiarity. Attackers weaponize rapport and likability. They might spend weeks building a relationship through social media or professional networks. Then they send a seemingly harmless link. This is heavily used in business email compromise, or BEC, where the attacker impersonates a trusted business partner. Third, urgency and scarcity. Attackers force fast, unthinking action through fear of missing out or manufactured deadlines. Your account will be closed in 1 hour if you don't verify your information. Limited time offer. Emergency situation, act now. Urgency shuts down the rational part of the brain. Fourth, consensus or social proof. Attackers exploit the herd mentality. Everyone in the department has already completed this survey. Your colleagues have already updated their passwords. When people think everyone else is doing something, they are more likely to do it themselves. Sample question: an attacker sends an email to an employee that appears to come from the company's legal department, threatening disciplinary action if a link is not clicked immediately. What social engineering principle is being exploited? Authority and intimidation, combined with urgency. Another question: an attacker creates a fake social media profile and builds a relationship with a target over several weeks before sending a malicious attachment. What principle is this? Trust and familiarity. Tip: when you see social engineering questions, identify the emotional trigger. Fear equals authority or urgency. Excitement equals urgency or scarcity. Peer pressure equals consensus. Pitfall: don't assume that only naive or new employees fall for social engineering. Experienced professionals fall for sophisticated attacks too. That's why training must be continuous and realistic. Social engineering attacks come through both digital and physical vectors. You need to recognize them all. On the digital side, you have phishing, smishing, and vishing. Phishing is email-based. Smishing is SMS or text message-based. Vishing is voice-based, phone calls. These are broad, untargeted attacks sent to large numbers of people, hoping someone will bite. Then you have spear phishing and whaling. Spear phishing is highly targeted. The attacker researches the victim and crafts a personalized message. Whaling is spear phishing that targets C-suite executives, the whales. These attacks are much harder to detect because they look legitimate. Then you have typo squatting and clickjacking. Typo squatting is registering a domain name that is a common misspelling of a legitimate site. Goggle.com instead of Google.com. Users who type the wrong address end up on a malicious site. Clickjacking is tricking users into clicking a hidden overlay button. You think you're clicking a harmless play button, but you're actually authorizing a malicious action. On the physical side, you have tailgating or piggybacking. This is following an authorized person through a secure door. The attacker waits for an employee to swipe their badge, then walks in right behind them. Most employees will hold the door out of politeness. That's a security failure. Then you have baiting. Leaving malware-loaded USB sticks in public places. In parking lots, in elevators, in bathrooms. Someone finds the USB stick, plugs it into their computer to see what's on it, and the malware executes. Then you have dumpster diving and shoulder surfing. Dumpster diving is extracting sensitive data from trash. Printed reports, old hard drives, sticky notes. Shoulder surfing is simply watching someone's screen or keyboard as they type their password. Sample question: an attacker sends a personalized email to the CFO, referencing a recent merger discussion and requesting a wire transfer. What type of attack is this? Whaling. It's spear phishing specifically targeting a C-suite executive. Another question: an attacker waits near a secure entrance and follows an employee through the door after they badge in. What is this called? Tailgating or piggybacking. Tip: know the difference between phishing, spear phishing, and whaling. Phishing is broad. Spear phishing is targeted. Whaling targets executives. Pitfall, don't forget physical vectors. The exam includes both digital and physical social engineering. Tailgating, baiting, dumpster diving, and shoulder surfing are all fair game. Let's talk about organizational maturity. Not every organization handles risk the same way. The Risk Maturity Model, or RMM, has 5 levels. Understanding where an organization falls helps you recommend appropriate improvements. Level 1 is ad hoc. Chaotic. Reactive. There are no consistent processes. Risk management happens only after a breach or an audit finding. Different departments do whatever they want. There is no coordination. This is where organizations start, but it's not where they should stay. Level 2 is preliminary. There are loose attempts at risk assessments, but they are siloed by department. IT does its own thing. Finance does its own thing. HR does its own thing. No one shares information. No one has a unified view of risk. Level 3 is defined. The organization has adopted standardized frameworks. NIST Risk Management Framework, ISO 27000 series, something like that. There are organization-wide policies and procedures. Everyone uses the same methodology. This is the minimum acceptable level for most regulated industries. Level 4 is integrated. Risk is factored into core business strategy and decision-making. When the company considers a new product, a new market, a new acquisition, risk assessment is part of the conversation from day one. Security is not an afterthought. Level 5 is optimized. Proactive, continuous improvement. The organization doesn't just manage risk, they use risk management as a strategic advantage. They anticipate threats before they emerge. They continuously refine their processes. Risk management is part of the culture. Sample question: an organization has implemented the NIST Risk Management Framework across all departments and uses consistent risk assessment methodologies. However, risk is not yet considered in strategic business decisions. What is the risk maturity level? Level 3, defined. Another question: an organization only performs risk assessments after a security incident or when required by an external auditor. There are no formal processes. What level is this? Level 1, ad hoc. Tip: look for keywords. Chaos equals ad hoc. Silos equal preliminary. Frameworks equal defined. Strategy equals integrated. Continuous improvement equals optimized. Pitfall: don't assume that a mature organization has no incidents. Maturity is about process, not perfection. Even optimized organizations have breaches. They just respond better. Let's close with how we upgrade the human. How we cultivate secure behavior. And this is a 3-level model. Awareness, training, and education. Level 1 is awareness. This is mindfulness. Keeping security top of mind for everyone in the organization. Awareness is broad and shallow. It's for everyone. The best way to deliver awareness is through engagement. Gamification. Phishing simulations. Internal security champions. Short videos. Posters. Newsletters. The goal is not to make everyone an expert. The goal is to make sure they stop and think before they click. Level 2 is training. This is specific, role-based application. Training teaches employees the exact procedures for handling data and systems within their specific job function. Your accounts payable team needs different training than your developers. Your HR team needs different training than your sales team. Training is about skills. It answers the question, how do I do my job securely? Level 3 is education. This is deep theoretical understanding. Education is for security professionals. It's for the people who need to solve complex, novel problems. A CISSP certification is education. Education answers the question, why does this work and how do I design something new? Here's the bottom line. Technology controls the perimeter. Firewalls, encryption, intrusion detection, they build the walls. But human resilience controls the core. The people inside those walls are the ones who make the final decisions. A well-trained, security-conscious workforce can stop attacks that no technology can block. Sample question: an organization provides all employees with a 1-hour annual presentation on phishing risks and distributes posters reminding them not to click suspicious links. What level of security behavior cultivation is this? Awareness. Another question: a security analyst completes a CISSP certification program to gain a deeper understanding of risk management frameworks and security architecture. What level is this? Education. Tip: remember the distinction. Awareness is for everyone. Training is role-specific. Education is for professionals. Pitfall: don't assume that one training session per year is enough. Security behavior degrades over time. Continuous reinforcement is essential. You've built the human firewall today. You understand the lifecycle, the risk responses, the social engineering tactics, and the 3 levels of cultivating secure behavior. Keep this foundation strong, and you will pass the exam. More importantly, you will be the security professional that organizations need. Good luck, and I'll see you in the next video.